Welcome to Behind the Barrier. My name is Sam, and today we have part 2 of my 2023 Supercar season preview. In part 1, I had a look at the upcoming calendar and shared my thoughts on the events that are and aren't on the schedule. But today we're turning our attention to the brand new cars, the brand new technical regulations in Supercars Gen 3. While I love my motorsport and have been watching it my whole life, I'm not the most technically savvy fan, so I'm going to keep things fairly high level when it comes to the technical stuff. But before we discuss the Gen 3 machinery, I think it's really important to discuss where we've come from in Gen 2. So the last major technical overhaul to the regulations came in 2014 with the car of the future. That saw the Holden Commodore and the Ford Mustang go up against each other, with Nissan, Mercedes and Volvo also joining the grid. Those last three unfortunately fell away in the years that followed, and we ended up towards the end of this era with just the Commodore and then the Ford Mustang left in competition. In terms of the power plants, they were running bespoke V8 engines, pretty much custom built here in Australia. They were very expensive engines, produced only by a handful of the teams and then sold to the rest of the grid, and they also required frequent rebuilds to keep their performance up. In terms of aerodynamics, well, Repco said in a video towards the end of 2022 that they estimate the Gen 2 supercars were producing as much as 800 kilos of downforce at 300 kilometers per hour, which is an insane amount of aerodynamic downforce for a touring car. And then in terms of other traits, there was a lot of unseen but very impactful engineering under the skin, stuff fans would never see in terms of upright design and stuff like that, which created a bunch of unnecessary investment and sort of technical redesign that just created a bit of an economic arms race between the teams. The end result was that the biggest and most well-funded teams often had a pretty unfair competitive edge on the rest of the grid and just increase the expense of the sport for everyone. So with all that in mind, and of course the demise of Holden and the Commodore that had been racing in the Supercar series, change was needed. And in 2023, that change arrives in Gen 3. So what does Gen 3 look like? Well, we're still going to have two cars, two brands represented on the grid. The Holden Commodore is going to be replaced by a Chevrolet Camaro, and Ford will continue to run a Mustang, albeit a newer version, which, despite being a GM guy, I have to admit that new Mustang looks incredible. In terms of engines, we're moving away from the bespoke custom built engines. We're still running V8s, but they're going to be largely crate motors. GM are going to be using a 5.7 litre in the Camaro, and Ford are going to be using a 5.4 litre Coyote engine in their Mustang. These Gen 3 engines are expected to produce about 50 horsepower less than the outgoing Gen 2 power plants, but the Gen 3 cars will also have a lot less drag, meaning the Camaro and the Mustang should still be clipping 300 kilometers per hour down Conrod Straight at the mountain. Another aerodynamic feature is the lack of downforce. These cars are going to have about 60% less downforce than the Gen 2 cars, and for me that is super exciting because I think we'll finally see these machines behave like the touring cars they're meant to be. Rattling through some last Gen 3 details, the cars are required to look a lot more like their road-going counterparts. There's going to be more control parts both within the vehicles and outside them, with the standardization of some pit equipment. The engines are expected to require less rebuilds less often, and all this should combine to reduce costs and hopefully improve the racing. So when the lights go green in Newcastle, who is going to be running what? Well, in the Camaro camp, 888 were the homologation team for General Motors, tasked with building the Camaro, and they're going to be running that car alongside Erebus, Brad Jones Racing, Team 18, Matt Stone Racing and Premier Air. On the Ford side of things, Dick Johnson Racing were tasked with building the Mustang, and they'll be running that car alongside Tickford, Walkinshaw Andretti United, that's the old Holden Racing team who shockingly switched to the blue side under Gen 3 regulations, Grove Racing and Blanchard Racing Team as well. In total, we are going to see 15 Camaros going up against 10 Mustangs, with Ford making the point halfway through 2022 that they were focused on quality rather than quantity. So what do I think of Gen 3 and the key wins? Well, Firstly, and this saddens me to say it, but I am glad that Supercars has finally separated from Holden given the demise of that brand. The farewell tour was far longer than anyone expected, and while it's great we're being able to commemorate the brand and everything it's accomplished in Supercars, it's time to turn our attention to the future. And I'm really glad that GM are continuing to play with the Camaro. I know not every Holden fan is finding that transition seamless, but for me, I'm really excited to see the GM vs Ford battle continue. I'm also really excited for the wheel-to-wheel racing. I think despite the sort of increase in downforce in recent years, Supercars has still remained one of the rawest and most exciting forms of motorsport. I think the reduction in downforce for Gen 3 and the introduction of more control parts is only going to increase the show. And I'm just excited we have some damn good looking cars. The Gen 2 machinery had their own charm, but they did look a little bit like aerodynamic test beds rather than something you could buy in a showroom. And I think the Gen 3 Camaro and Mustang look awesome. In fact, I'll admit it right here, despite being a GM fan, I think that new Mustang looks insanely good. I do have some concerns about Gen 3, and the first two at these points come with any sort of technical overhaul to a form of motorsport, and Supercars is no different. The first one is your typical early generation challenges with just securing enough cars and making them in time for the first event. It sounds like a few teams are a bit nervous about having every car ready for testing. This should be okay for the opening round in Newcastle, but what will likely be a challenge is the actual number of spare parts they have available. I'm really nervous about turn 1 at Newcastle. That corner has claimed many vehicles over the year, caused many pile-ups, and we're going to have 25 brand spanking new Gen 3 Supercars charging in there in one big group. I am sweating just thinking about it. I'm sweating even more about the next point though, because I am going to mention the P word, parity. Look, anytime you have a technical overhaul on this scale that touches both the engines and the aerodynamics, there is a risk things might not be as balanced as they should be out of the box. Supercars have been running their Gen 3 prototypes for quite some time now, but there's no doubt that those two machines can't produce the same level of data as 25 vehicles running around racetracks all around the country. Media coverage suggests the engines are in a pretty good sweet spot, but it does sound like Ford have expressed some concerns over the aerodynamic process Supercars have used to paritize the cars. Look, for me, I just hope that any disparity is sorted before the season begins and that every stakeholder is comfortable with the final shape of the cars. I remember the parity wars on the internet from only a few years ago and really hope that Gen 3 doesn't start off that way as well. But look, as I said, with a technical overhaul on this scale, there's always a risk tweaks will need to be made after the season begins. And my final concern with Gen 3 is that we still only have two brands racing in the sport in Ford and GM. It sounds like Gen 3 was designed to allow about 9 different manufacturers to come and play if they wanted. None have taken the bait for now though. I'm not upset with a Ford vs GM situation. I actually like the setup of two clear camps. I think it's really good for the rivalry and the fan bases. But from a longevity perspective, there is always a risk that if Ford or GM, more likely so, do anything to the Mustang or the Camaro, which is a little bit rumoured on the Camaro side, the sport could be in a bit of an awkward position with, once again, a car being taken off the road but still being raced on the track. So here's hoping Gen 3 produces a sort of racing and economic environment that attracts some other brands, because I would really like to see them come into the sport. For the sake of balance, I included 3 positive and 3 negative things in terms of my thoughts on Gen 3, but overall, I'm actually really excited about this new generation of supercar. I'm overwhelmingly optimistic about the era that's about to arrive. I cannot wait for lights out in Newcastle, and hope you guys will join me on this channel as we do round previews, reviews, and lots of discussion videos in between as well. In fact, I want to bring a few of those to you before the season even starts. But for now, I'd love to know your thoughts on Gen 3. What track are you most excited to see them at, whether that be your local track or just a circuit you're excited to see this new generation of car race on? Would love to hear your thoughts, and I hope you guys will stick with me in the future videos coming to you very soon.